There is no feed yet. Really? Are you sure about that? Okay, let me know if you're not actually able to. I've been playing, and if you can't see it, feed is working. Refresh your head. Okay, where was I? Well, one last chorus then. Lots of feed. Okay. Well, glad to hear it's working, and welcome. This morning, just going to do a not too long live stream. That is, I will try to keep things concise and to the point, which is not really my brand, apparently. Just ask Ms. Fretboard. I am not a concise individual. But I have just really one main thing I want to talk about here and a few examples, and then have time to take some questions as well. But welcome. Boy, there's like 100 people here. That's fabulous, from all over. Nice to see lots of familiar folks, some folks from the membership, many people that are not. Welcome, everybody. Feel free to leave comments in the chat. It won't really distract me. If you have a question while I'm doing something, you can always drop the question while you're thinking of it, and then I can get to it. Hopefully, I can get to as many of them as possible. But so the best way to fix your blues. Let's get to the point. Obviously, there are a lot of things you could do to improve your playing, but I really think if you're interested at all in improvising, or whether you're playing single note or whether you're playing, self-accompanied blues, whatever it is, the main thing I think that can really, if you're coming up with your own licks and ideas, or you're just trying to put licks together for yourself that you already know, I think the main thing that can really change your playing is to think ahead. And by that I mean to not react to the chord progression as it's going by, but to play towards or into whatever is coming next. Now, I realize if you're not necessarily focused on improvising per se yet, that this may be an idea that you have some other steps you need to get through to get to this. But even if you've got minimal experience just trying to move around like some pentatonic licks, some blues licks, and if you're just getting started, keeping your thumb going, or if you're, improvising with other people, like, you're playing with another guitar player and you're, trading solos or whatever, all of this, can apply. So what I mean by thinking ahead is that, you've got the chord progression. Let's say we're doing 12-bar blues and we're playing an E. I'm just doing this steady bass self-accompanied thing. Let's talk about like the shape of the chord progression, the form of the chord progression, and your phrasing, right? So when you're faced with a chorus of blues, like a chance to solo, it can feel like a lot of, like, just a huge blank piece of paper, right? Like you could do anything, and so you just start to play, and in a few minutes you go through your stash of licks, of ideas. If you can start by just cutting the chord progression, the blues progression down to size, that can go a long way towards reducing that panic over having all that space to fill up. And when you can look at the blues as a structure, not just as this wide open space, then you can start to play through that chord progression on purpose, and you can play sort of with more intention. Now, right off the bat, I want to say, I know that a lot of this sort of goes against the grain of why we all love to listen to and play blues, because it feels like this spontaneous, expressive art form that doesn't involve a lot of thinking, a lot of planning, right? It's supposed to just kind of come welling up out of your soul. But if it's not just happening for you, if it's not just welling up out of your soul, what you got to realize is the people that we listen to, that we love, have been through some kind of process to organize their playing. Now, it may not have been as conscious as, sitting down and learning how to play blues, but at the very least, there was a certain kind of learning going on in which, musicians listen to each other. I mean, as far back as, Muddy Waters. Like, he was listening to records. He didn't have a lot of records, but he was listening to records and figuring stuff out. And, in the Buddy Guy autobiography, he talks about, like, sitting down and trying to figure out, like, John Lee Hooker grooves and how to play, like, the guitar players that he could go and see. This process has been going on for a long time. And even if it looks like people don't study blues, like the great, like, masters that we all really revere, even if it looks like they're just doing it, like, they all went through some kind of apprenticeship, self-imposed effort to learn how to play. So there's nothing sort of contrary to the spirit of this kind of music, in my opinion, in getting organized and thoughtful about how to do it better. I just think of it as a series of shortcuts. Like, you could sit and listen to records for 20 years until you absorb all these ideas about how to phrase and how to think about the blues form. Or you could take the shortcut of this explanation, which says, this is what usually happens. This is how it usually works. This is something that usually sounds good. So take it in that spirit, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So if we've got this blues form, right, it's 12 bars. And the first thing we can do is cut it up into 3 lines, right? We've got the first line where we start on the 1 chord and go to the 4 chord and come back to the 1. And then in the next 4 bars, we start on the 4 chord and we go back to the 1 chord again. And then for the third line, the third set of 4 measures, we start on the 5 chord, go to the 4, and then come back to the 1. So a couple things about that right now. All 3 lines are the same length. You've got 3 lines of 4 bars each. Each line starts on a different chord. The first line starts on the 1 chord, the next line starts on the 4 chord, and the third line starts on the 5 chord. And finally, all 3 lines resolve back to 1. So in the first one, we go 1, 4, and back to 1. For the next line, we start on the 4 chord, and then we resolve back to 1. And in the turnaround, we start on the 5, we go to the 4, and then we go to the 1 chord. So every line starts on a different chord. Every line ends up on the same chord, back on the 1. That's important. Now, all I mean by thinking ahead is that you can wait for the chord progression to start. 1, 2, 3, and. Right, so every time I hear a chord, I'm going to play something. Right, so I'm waiting for the bar to start and then I'm playing. And that'll work, right? You will play things that will sound good inside of those chords. Right, so 1. Right? And that'll be functional. But if you start before each measure or before the next important thing that's happening, you can create a sense of momentum. So if I start before I get to the 1, so at the very beginning of the blues, say 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, right? So That makes a big difference to my ear. And you hear both, and they're both important, and you use both, starting from inside the measure and starting ahead of the measure. But starting ahead of the measure is not as, I mean, you hear it all the time, but at least I know when I was learning to play, it wasn't that intuitive a thing. It's like I would hear the chord and be like, oh, time to play, as opposed to thinking, what chord is coming next and how can I get us there? And that really, you could like log out of YouTube right now, and that is the thing that I came here to talk about. I'm going to elaborate on it. But that's really the main thing, just to shift your thinking from reacting to the chord to anticipating and taking the listener into the chord. Makes a huge difference. And if you go back and listen to your favorite blues guitar players, I swear you will go, oh my God, they're doing it all the time. I mean, all you have to do is think about like classic blues songs. And the way that they're phrased. And you'll hear this kind of leading into the downbeat. Now, just going in with a short phrase, if you want to really quantify it, I'm basically playing from the and of 3. Like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. And if you want to keep yourself occupied some rainy afternoon, just sit around with the pentatonic scale and that phrasing and just try to find every possible way that you can lead from a note from the blues scale or the E pentatonic scale into the root by the time you get to the downbeat. You know, just keep going through the scale, start on different notes of the scale, and just try to land on the root. That alone, just as a way to kick yourself into each line, will work great. So if you just think in terms of every other bar, like bar 1, when you're starting off, and then bar 3, going into bar 3 to take you back to the 1 chord, right? Because we're always coming back to the 1. And then going into bar 5, and then going into bar 7 when we come back to the 1 again. And then going into bar 9, we're going to the 5 chord. This time we want to land on the root of B. It almost sounds like a solo already, which is kind of amazing. So that's the first thing, just these short resolutions, breaking up the blues into these 3 lines, and then looking at where the important moments in the chord progression, where you want to land. You want to lead your way into the beginning of each line, so into bar 1, into bar 5, into bar 9, and then you want to also always lead into not always, but you want to try to lead into the return to the 1 chord, which comes at the midpoint of every line. So into the beginning of bar 1, play the 4 chord, and then coming out of the 4 chord, coming into bar 3, you want to lead into that. And then at the end of the line, heading into the beginning of line 2 and the 4 chord, try to play into that. And then on your way back to the 1, that's the next place you're headed. Then you're heading to the 5 chord. Right? That alone is a good exercise to just go around and just see if you can play simple licks that will lead you into every other bar, basically into all of the odd bars. Now, that's the first idea. The next thing, I have 2 more. The next thing is that blues licks of the home key, so E blues licks when you're in the key of E, always resolve back to the 1 chord, no matter what you're on at the time. So if you're on the 1 chord and you play a longer phrase, that helps you get back to the 1 chord. Now you can be on the 1 chord and just be resolving on E. You could be on the 4 chord. And that same blues lick, even though you're on an A chord and you're not spelling out any part of the A chord, Gives you a sense of resolve, of coming home, of landing on the one chord, whether you're on the E or the A, or if you're on the B chord. So, the second idea is that you can play these longer phrases in the middle of each line, right? A short phrase at the beginning of the line, and now I'm going to the 4 chord, and here, starting on the 4 chord, I don't even have to think about, like, does this fit with an A chord? Is it going to work over the A chord? I'm just going to play a longer blues phrase. As soon as I get to the A chord, and it's going to bring me back to the E. Now, instead of playing a short phrase, so I'm playing this longer phrase. So that's in the middle of the line, and that will work in the middle of every line. So if I just play a short phrase into the beginning of each line, here's line 2, and then again, that longer phrase. And if I'm counting that out, that's playing from the and of 1, 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1. And then here's my B7 chord, and now I'm back on the A again. So, with those 2 phrases, you can also sit around with that second kind of phrasing. And of 1, 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 1. And you can just come up with all different kinds of licks, just pouring the blues scale into that one specific rhythmic container. I did a lesson a few weeks ago here on the channel where I talked about this specific thing of coming up with licks by starting with the phrasing first and then putting the scale into that phrasing. And I'll try to remember to put a link down below in the notes so you can go and check that out. But that idea is really effective. And once you have these 2 rhythms under your fingers, you can use it so that when you walk into a blues chorus, you can do it with a default kind of call and response shape. Right? So just using these 2 licks, we now have this. And it doesn't fill up the whole form. Like, there's a lot of space. There's a lot of space at the end of every line, which is great, right? Because you don't necessarily want to be playing all the time. It has a more relaxed quality. It feels more vocal. And also, you can ultimately end up doing stuff with that space at the end of the line. You can play a kind of secondary lick at the end, right? Like some double stops, or at the end of the last line, you can play a turnaround. You know, you're leaving yourself a little breathing room. Maybe even if you're playing with other people, you're leaving room for them to do some kind of, you know, call and response thing with you. Like you've played your solo phrase and then they're going to respond to it. It's good manners to leave a little space, whether for yourself or for somebody else. So the idea of playing into the downbeat, the idea of playing licks that resolve back to 1, those are all ways of leading into what's coming next, ways of playing towards whatever's coming next and leading the listener through the chord progression instead of just reacting to what's happening and playing afterwards. So the third thing, and I saw there's some questions, so I'll get to those in a moment. But the third thing I want to just mention, not in quite as much detail, is that if you're wondering how to use chords, like if you're thinking, oh man, you know, I don't want to just play like these 3 basic chords. I want to have some motion and I want to use some different voicings. Chords follow the same rules. you're always headed somewhere, right? If you're on the minute you play an E chord at the beginning of the blues form, you are on your way to A. You're never just on E, unless you're playing like one of those Howlin' Wolf tunes that just like sits on one chord, right? Which is also, of course, deeply cool. But most of the time, the chord is always headed somewhere, right? So if you're on an E chord and you're trying to figure out like, well, how can I have some motion? Think about what the E chord will do to get to the A chord. Like in this case, maybe this kind of inverted chord shape, like an E and then an E with the G sharp in the bass, and then an A. And by the same token, when you're on an A chord, you are already on your way back to E. Which is why, like when you hear older blues, like if you listen to like blues from the 20s, especially if there's like, if there were like jazz piano players on the session, like sometimes you hear like James P. Johnson or someone like that playing blues behind a singer or a trumpet player or whatever, you hear all this emotion, right? So, you don't just hear, you hear, right? Because they're thinking ahead. If they're on an E, they're thinking, well, maybe I'll rock up to the 5 chord and that will actually take me back to the 1. So they'll do this thing of sitting and rocking between 1 and 5 for 3 bars and then moving through some different E chords. They wouldn't do this in the 1920s, but getting to that half step. And then this kind of chord, this sort of diminished sound, A sharp diminished, that's also designed to resolve back to E. All of these notes want to go. You want to resolve. That's a bigger topic, but I just wanted to point out in passing that this idea of leading somewhere applies to chords as well as to single note lines. And to go even slightly further afield, if you are interested in playing more swing and jazz inflected versions of the blues, this is where altered chords come in, right? Because altered chords have a sense of motion. So if you're like, well, I learned this altered chord, but why did I learn it? It's like, well, because that is a sound that will take you from 1 to 4. And if that sound will take you there as a chord, then it'll take you there as a lick. So all these things are connected, and what I'm trying to get at is when you hear stuff and it grabs your ear and you're like, what is that? The next thought is often like, well, why are they doing that? And they're doing it usually to create motion because someone is thinking about being on their way somewhere. And so if you can start to develop that approach as well of like, where am I headed? Not what just happened and how do I deal with it, but how do I take charge and draw the listener towards the next thing, then that will, I believe, fix your blues to a very great extent. So let me grab some of these questions here. Let's see. Okay, I went back too far. Okay, question from Itchok. Hey, man. So we can pick any lick between the blues chords, e.g. 1, 4, or 5. Any blues lick that lands on the root is fair game. Any blues lick will resolve. When you're heading from 4 to 1, from 5 to 1, any blues lick that lands on the root at the any blues lick that anticipates the timing by starting ahead of, in the previous bar and then lands on E. Like anytime you're going from 4 to 1, like and you're coming into bar 7, or if you're coming into bar 10 from 5 to 4 to 1, then any you got to use your ear and your, but as a starting point, yeah, basically blues licks that are in the home scale, in the E blues scale, and land on the root and anticipate the chord you're going to will work. So. If you take that apart, it's got a lot of notes that clash with the A chord, right? That note does not belong in an A chord, right? But the momentum of that'll get you there. So, hope that answers the question, but post again if it doesn't. Tracy, did you get square about the chords you were asking? I see that Blues Picker answered your question, but if that is still not clear, I will detail it. Let's see. From Jim, playing the ands can be more challenging for me while doing it consciously, i.e. counting each beat rather than by feel. Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. You have to sort of practice this into your brain, I mean, you don't have to do, and a little goes a long way. I would just take some simple licks. I mean, first just be counting. If you can keep the bass going with your thumb on 1, 2, 3, 4, and then count the ands, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and then maybe put in your index finger on the ands. If you go check out those lessons, I'll put a link to these too. 6 Steps to Playing Steady Bass Blues in E, also on my channel. The first lesson in that series is all about just cultivating that shuffle feel by playing your index on the 4th string on the root and getting that sort of John Lee Hooker thing going. And that's just 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and then and 2 and 3 and 4 and 2 and 3 and 4 and I believe in saying the stuff out loud while you play, because it forces you to hardwire the connection between the idea and the reality on the guitar, right? I mean, you don't know if you're really nailing the beats and the offbeats that you want until you make a conscious effort to do so. The goal is to get it, to work through that conscious stage and get it back into your subconscious, right? And I think this is where it gets tricky, because like you say, it's a feel thing, and most people, we all do this. You learn this music and you kind of feel how it goes and you play off of that. It's just when you get to the point where you want to do more with it, then you have to go through that conscious phase again. You forget all the conscious phases you went through to learn to play as well as you currently can. But if you want to play like you're already playing, you don't even need to be here, right? Why would we be talking about this if you didn't want to get better? If you want to get better and do something additional to what you're already doing, to me, I imagine, in my own experience, and that's all I can really speak to, it takes going through that a new conscious period of figuring out what it is you're trying to do and putting it into your playing. Okay, more questions. All of them looking really good. From Blue Max, can you play those passing chords as some other player plays the straight 1, 4, and 5? Oh, that is an excellent question. It kind of depends what instruments you're playing with and what register you are in. So if you're playing with just a bass player, I wouldn't put those voicings down here, because the bass player's trying to work in, not this in an octave lower probably, but you're going to be in the way. But if you're up here, you can play all kinds of things because it's out of the bass player's register. It only gets really a little funky if, someone's just playing the Chicago blues changes, and all of a sudden you're up there going. Now, if you're playing with someone who will react to what you're doing and go, oh, we're going there now, then cool. But if you're playing with someone who's a real, like, I'm laying it down and here's where it is, follow me, then it's not gonna work as well for you to start mixing up the chords. So it kind of depends on the situation. You can imply some of those more extended chords with your improvising. Again, it's a density thing, right? Like down here, that's going to mess with people down in this end of the register, right? Chords up here. Less obtrusive, but if you've got like a pianist up there or another guitar player playing in that same register, that's going to get a little clunky too. But single note stuff, you can start to, incorporate those sounds in. And if the other people around you pick up on it, great. And if they don't, no harm, no foul. It just sounds like you played something a little exotic for a couple of minutes. Okay, Tracy, you're squared away on the chords. Good. From JC, maybe I answered, do you pretty much solo in the home key over 1, 4, and 5, or do you mix in other keys? I will, to put it as concisely as possible, the foundation to me is the home scale. So if I'm playing blues in E, then I'm gonna, like 50% of my vocabulary at least is gonna be the blues. And actually, yes, can answer 2 questions at once. So the E minor pentatonic scale has 5 notes, penta, right, like pentagon, root, flat 3, 4, 5, and flat 7. Then you get back to the root. And Jeff Mackerlane, what's happening? Go check out Jeff's channel. He is the bomb. Okay, root. The blues scale is root, flat 3, 4, add in flat 5, and then 5, flat 7, root. I kind of use them interchangeably. I kind of talk about them interchangeably, but blues scale, when you're playing like electric blues licks, you end up bending from the 4 to the 5 a lot anyway. So this flat 5 thing doesn't really matter. But for like pianists, like they don't have any bending, so they'll get that sound. They'll get that sound using the flat 5, and I like to do it too because not a lot of bending going on down here on the acoustic guitar. So maybe the lion's share of the sound is coming from the blues scale, but as I get to the other, 2 things. The main addition to what's going on that I would make would be to start framing each chord a little bit in terms of its chord tone. So like playing the major third on the E chord, right? So instead of having just that sound, we got, and it's sort of it's a way to resolve. Right, that major third tells you, we're back on the 1 chord. And by the same token, when you were up on the 4 chord, right, so I'm tagging the major third of the A chord, but then coming down the blues scale, and I'm going to land on my major third when I get back to the 1 chord, right? So those are places where you're adding in, but I'm basically looking at it as I've got these 2 things laid on top of each other. I've got the blues scale, always and forever, and then at certain moments, I'm laying notes of the chord that I am currently on top of that blues scale and favoring those notes, right? So if I'm on the A chord, this C sharp is going to get some love. If I'm on an E chord, this G sharp is going to get some love and attention. And then when I'm on B, I'm going to push that D chord, that D note, that flat third, towards this note, towards the third of B. I'm not going to get all the way there, but I'm implying that that's important. And then, of course, this all exists on a continuum. By the time you get to listening to anybody from a jazz perspective, they're going to spell out the chords a lot, and they're going to use the blues as kind of the coloration, right? Like if you listen to, I don't know, one of my favorite examples for this is always Stanley Turrentine, the saxophone player. And he plays all the bebop vocabulary, you know. So, and so he's basically like using each chord as the framework, but then he'll resolve, like he'll finish his phrases, or he'll even take a whole chorus where he's just playing the blues, and then he'll go back into that thing of playing the changes. And all the musicians from that era of jazz, that was the MO. That was the sound of hard bop, was that mix between playing the changes and playing the blues. Right? Okay, more questions. From Peter, hopefully this lesson will be archived on YouTube. Who can't watch and have to go slop the virtual hugs. Yes, I'll leave it up. For the foreseeable future. How's that? From Eugene, new to this style, love, but coordinating the thumb with the licks is a challenge. Yeah, that is the central challenge. So again, I'd suggest going and checking out that 6 Steps to Playing Fingerstyle Blues series on here to get more just basics on doing that. Jim, I've always struggled with steady bass. Oh, I'm going back to my David Hamburger steady bass course. Oh, the True Fire one, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of, that is the foundation. I mean, there's also doing this with the alternating style, and these same rules apply, but I find it easier to get started with the steady bass because there's more room for your fingers to do what they gotta do. So let me play a couple more choruses. And obviously, like in the examples that I've given, I've been playing very specific licks, but you know, you can open up those licks to more ideas in terms of the phrasing. You can open up the sort of the back end of each line to have some additional like call and response things where you're filling in after you've played the licks. So let me just play through a couple choruses where basically I'm going to play a short phrase into the downbeat. I'm going to play a longer phrase getting back to the 1 chord, and then I'll play some kind of chord response to all of that at the end of each line. Right, so the lines get a little blurry. You'll notice sometimes the licks drag over the bar line a little bit. You know, I'm throwing in some thirds from the different chords I was on. But just having a framework to start with is really helpful. So you're not just thinking like, what do I play? Right? And once you have that framework, then you can start to swap in different licks. And so if you're looking for a way to get sort of wade into improvising, then this is one way to start doing it. From Jam Lee, can you comment on your chord thinking, like for E, A, B, which if any do you think about in terms of the seventh versus just a major chord? Okay, if it's blues, it's always seventh chords. That's just pretty much how people play it. I mean, there are sort of jazzier exceptions to that, but basically it's E7, A7, B7. And then as far as, you know, there are so many possibilities in terms of chord substitutions. But I'm basically thinking out of a very small set of chord voicings, right? And if I want to start moving around, I mean, if I'm playing steady bass, I'm not even really playing very many chords. I'm mostly just playing the root, and the root is standing in for the whole chord progression. The root is like the rhythm section. But if I want to start moving around, I generally reach for these 3-note chord voicings, which come from the playing of Freddie Green and other swing era guitar players. And they're great because they have a little bit of melodic information, a little bit of bass motion, and they have some notes in between that kind of hold it all together. So I probably need to do a whole lesson on that at some point, but so that's a good reminder. So yeah, so there are a few things. I mean, these things have already come up, but there are a couple of things that you need to have going on in order for any of this to work. I mean, the main thing is a coordinated right hand, right? Being able to hold down the thumb and do different things on top of it with your fingers, right? Different kinds of rhythms and coordinations. And you need to have some kind of vocabulary of licks in order to make all this go. And then, you know, a sense of phrasing, and that's what we've really been talking about, is phrasing. Is like, how do the notes relate to the underlying chord progression and the time, right? So a couple things you can do. I've mentioned a few different videos that are sort of relevant to this here on my channel. Over the last month or so, I've been posting different things related to improvisation and developing that rhythmic coordination, because next month I just did this workshop last weekend, which I know some of you are at. And then this coming month in November, in my ongoing membership, the Fingerstyle 5, we're going to spend the entire month just doing a deep dive into these fundamentals of improvisation, like just the right hand coordination, building a vocabulary of licks, and looking at how to apply that and like creating shape out of just a vamp. Like, how do you, if you're given just an E chord to work with, how can you use that as a way to focus? Like, there's a lot of variables of playing blues, right? So if you just strip out the chords and go, well, we're going to play like a 1-chord blues, how can you use phrasing and groove and a sense of, you know, shape and form to create something out of that sort of, you know, seemingly abstract 1-chord situation, right? So all these things we've been talking about apply to that. So next month I'm going to do nothing but focus on these sort of fundamental improvisational skills in my membership. So I think I've already put a link to that. If you want to check that out, you can learn more about that in the notes as well. One more question from Richard. Can you go through the rake back, which you often use with the right hand? I'll do it briefly, and there also is a whole lesson on that. It's called rakes, triplets, and something. And I'll try to remember to put a link to that down below too, because there's a whole lesson here on that. But basically, it's done with the index finger and the thumb, and it has to do with the angle of your wrist here. So what I'm doing is, the basic shuffle pulse is this 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and like I've been talking about, right? So it's basically happening on the ands, on the and of 4. And all I'm doing is I'm dragging my index finger back string by string until I get when I finished with the 5th string, I've rolled my hand so that my thumb is now underneath the low string facing out, and then I'm snapping away from the guitar. So in slow motion, which is very unconvincing, it looks like this. And it's in the context of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. So I guess I did it earlier than the end of 4, but all right, so that's the rig. So yeah, all those things, obviously, it's having the licks and having the thumb, but then it's also all those other little rhythmic things that really make it go. And can't say it enough, like groove is really underneath everything, right? And if the groove's not there, then all the licks in the world are not going to sound cool, right? So a good groove, a few simple licks, a little bit of call and response, and a sensibility to what that shuffle feel sounds like will serve you in really good stead. So I'll try to get those links up. Check out those other lessons that I referenced. Check out the link to what we're going to be doing in November, if you like. And thanks for being here. Thanks for watching. I'll play a couple more courses of blues, and we'll call it a day. Thanks for being here, everybody. See you next time.